Hey everyone, Elia here, and welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. Today we're starting with a new format, one which I hope to do more of. As some of you may know, one of my passions is history, and this episode is a good example, I think, of why that is. Guest host Abdulla Moaswes, a Palestinian scholar and old buddy of mine, is joined by two scholars of Kashmir, Ather Zia and Hafsa Kanjwal, who will introduce themselves in a bit, of course, to talk about, well, Kashmir. It's a long episode, but that's because we wanted to make sure to present Kashmir's history on its own terms, a Kashmir perspective, if you want, that does not center Pakistan and certainly not India, or China for that matter. If you're listening to this on the public feeds, please know that you can already listen to the full episode on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. For as little as $5 a month, you will get access to the entire archive of the From the Periphery Media Collective podcast, including, of course, the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, the From the Periphery podcast, the Mutual Aid podcast, as well as our newly released podcast, Khida, Jewish Counter-Colonial Thoughts, and The Inconvenient Revolution, our podcast on Syria. These are all publicly available. You can search for them on your podcast app right now. But by joining the Patreon, you not only support our projects, which will also soon include a zine, by the way, but you will also occasionally get early access to full episodes like this one. One more thing before starting the episode properly. We are keen on getting audience feedback to better understand what we need to prioritize. If, for example, you would like for there to be more episodes on Kashmir, the best way to do so is by connecting with us via our Patreon. By doing so, you would be able to suggest topics on virtually anything, as well as guests, of course, in addition to the perks that I already mentioned. Okay, so here's the episode. For much of the last 3 decades, Kashmir has been among the most militarized places on Earth, with its territory divided between 3 nuclear-armed states of India, Pakistan, and China. Earlier this year, events in the region acted as a prelude to an armed confrontation between India and Pakistan, which the former used as an opportunity to deeply entrench an emergent settler-colonial form of rule in the territory. Many view the Kashmir question as simply a territorial dispute between these 3 states. But as this podcast series will demonstrate, the Kashmir question is one about colonial occupation and anti-colonial resistance. In this podcast series, Hafsa, Ather, and Abdulla first outline the origins of the Kashmir crisis, explaining how the region came to be partitioned as a result of British and Indian colonialism. They contextualize Kashmir's colonization within the project of Indian statebuilding, as well as the territory's relevance to regional geopolitics. In part 2, they discuss Kashmiri resistance over the decades, including the events that led to and comprised the Kashmir Intifada that broke out in the late 1980s. The third and final episode consists of an assessment of Kashmir's current status, and the guests will present us their outlook for the future. So, that's all from me, folks. Here is the episode. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.
Hello everyone, welcome to The Fire These Times. My name is Abdulla Moaswes and I am privileged to host this episode. I am a researcher, a writer, translator. I largely work on the interconnections between different colonial projects in the contemporary moments. Obviously, my main focus is on Palestine and Kashmir, but I'm also interested in many other ones. And it is my honor today to introduce or to ask our 2 guests to introduce themselves, where we are going to be talking about the situation in Kashmir, its historical sort of genesis, and coming to some of the more sort of contemporary developments that have taken place in recent weeks. And so with that in mind, I would like to ask our 2 guests, who I'm really happy to have with us, to introduce themselves. First, I can ask Professor Ather Zia to go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting us. My name is Ather Zia, and I'm an anthropologist, poet. I write short fiction and columns. Currently, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. I have also written Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which was published by Washington University Press in 2019. And I also have founded a webzine called Kashmir Lit in 2008. Alongside Hafsa, I'm also one of the co-founders of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, which is an interdisciplinary network of scholars who work on Kashmir region. And I currently also am in the editorial collective of cultural anthropology.
Thank you so much. And Professor Hafsa, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you also for inviting me. So my name is Hafsa Kanjwal. I'm a historian of modern South Asia, and I'm an associate professor at Lafayette College. And I'm also the author of a book called Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, which basically looks at how the Indian government used state building and client regimes in Kashmir to entrench its occupation in Kashmir in the post 1947 time period. And that was published in July of 2023.
Thank you so much. And I should reiterate as well, both of the books that have been mentioned, and of course, the Kashmiri Lit platform are incredible resources for any listeners to check out. And with that being said, I mean, I think we can start the conversation by probably, I guess it makes sense to start from the beginning, actually. And with that being said, I can ask either of you really to kind of give us a little bit of a kind of primer about kind of like the emergence of British colonialism and then later on Indian colonialism in Kashmir and the role of the Dogra state in between.
Before we even, I guess, begin with the Dogras, I guess one of the things that I wanted to say was that where you start history is also really important. And of course, because we are talking about Kashmir's modern history, some people start in 1947, some people start in 1931, which is when this freedom struggle within Kashmir began, and start in 1846. But you can also go earlier, right? Because Kashmir was, for much of its ancient and medieval history, an independent kingdom. And then subsequently, it was folded into as a province during the time of the Mughal, Afghan, and the Sikh Empire. And so at the time of British colonization, as it begins in the subcontinent, Kashmir was basically a province within the larger Sikh Empire with its seat of power in the city of Lahore. And so as the British were trying to take over Punjab, one of the things that they did is they used the assistance of a Hindu warlord from the region of Jammu, which is south of the Kashmir Valley and also adjacent to Punjab, to basically get his help. He was a soldier, an important soldier, high-ranking soldier and official in the Sikh Empire, to get his help basically to win in the Anglo-Sikh wars. And so once he did that, the British rewarded him and essentially his lineage with the Kashmir Valley and some of the territories around it. And the Dogra armies kind of also expanded a bit into different regions. And so that basically puts together what we call the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And so this was a state that was at the northernmost tip of the subcontinent. So that means that it was, of course, bordered by the subcontinent, but then also very close to Russia, very close to China. It was an important state for the British at this time because of the Great Game with Russia. And so whoever ruled Kashmir, this was an important state. And one of the main things that I guess for the listeners to know is that the Dogras were not native to the entirety of the region. They were just native to the region of Jammu. And so one of the things they basically had to do is gain their legitimacy as the rulers of this princely state. And at this time, a majority of the population of the state was Muslim majority, around 3/4, with significant Kashmiri Hindu, or what's called the Kashmiri Pandit population, especially in the valley, as well as Buddhists and Sikh minorities as well. And so the Dogras, as Hindu monarchs, were ruling over a majority Muslim population. And so one of the ways that the British, as well as the Dogras, kind of legitimize their rule is to proclaim this idea of Hindu indigeneity to Kashmir. So they really presented the Dogras as kind of the rightful heirs or rulers of this region that was really kind of underpinned by this idea that Hindus were the rightful owners of this state. And as a result, Dogra state practices also were extremely discriminatory towards Kashmir's Muslim majority population, who were largely peasants and artisans, and had to pay extremely extractive taxes to the Dogra state, and were really not able to have much social mobility, much political expression. And so in response to Dogra oppression, starting in the late 1800s, but really culminating in the 1920s and 1930s, Kashmiri Muslims basically started their freedom struggle. And in the subcontinent, this was against British rule, right? British colonization. But in this princely state, this was against the Dogra rulers. And so that's kind of where we're at. And that's the struggle that Kashmiris are really aspiring for better economic empowerment, like more sovereignty at the time. And then 1947, which is when the partition happens and India and Pakistan become two different nation states, the princely rulers were given a chance or an opportunity to side with either based on the geography and also the demographics of the population. And there is an actual massacre that happens in the region of Jammu where many of the Muslims who resided there wanted to join Pakistan. They were afraid that the Dogra Maharaja was going to join India. And so that massacre basically is what starts this dispute that happens in Kashmir in 1947. So maybe I'll stop here and Ather can kind of continue with what happens next.
Thank you, Hafsa. I think I can pick up a few threads here. One thing that I do want to mention that when the British East India Company, they sold the entire area of the region of Kashmir to the Dogras, according to the Treaty of Amritsar, and it's considered to be one of the cruelest land estate deal because this sold the people as well as their territory. And then the Dogra, they paid 75,000 Nanak Shahi rupees, the currency of the time. And for the next 100 years of their rule or more, they were basically spent in retrieving their investment that they had made. And that's just wanted to add that little bit. So after 1947, I do want to mention that for the last 70 years, Kashmiris in every decade have recounted this story to anyone who would want to hear, to anyone who is coming to Kashmir or outside Kashmir wants to know. But there has been a hegemonic narrative that has been prevalent through Indian media, through Indian government, and also Indian diplomacy in the last 60 years or so, through its Cold War alliances, which has really downgraded Kashmir to something that is not recognizable to the people on ground. As Hafsa said, this is a genuine struggle for self-determination. But there's also a couple of other things that we want to question in this moment in the 21st century. Kashmiris are often made to recount this history. They're made to memorize the laws and the United Nations resolutions and the wherewithal of the nation states, and then they have to prove as if they are genuine in asking what they are asking for, whether that be self-determination through independence or that be joining Pakistan, or yes, there is a collaborator class in Kashmir which was pivotal in 1947 in collaborating with India and also later on becoming their client politicians, the remnants of which are still in place and have secured the control for India in this moment in the Indian administered Kashmir. So the questions that I was referring to are, do Kashmiris have to adhere to what the fleeing colonizers and the fleeing monarch was imposing on them, which is either join India or Pakistan? So I think in this moment, these questions really have to be revisited, and then also envisioning what Kashmiris want and not having them prove time and again through blood, through dying every day in all of the wars, as to what they want, because there has been an imposition of this nation state system in which populations like Kashmiris, who for the longest possible time, the contours of their territory were really secured by the Himalayas, and they thought of themselves and were a distinct people. So they have to time and again prove that they're genuine. And in this moment, their entire struggle in the last 70 years, slowly and steadily, through Indian machinations, through the laws that they executed inside Kashmir, it has been downgraded and criminalized to an extent that today India can call all the militants who are still active in the region or people who are politically connected to the movement, they can easily be called terrorists. So what have Kashmiris demanded in the last 70 years is the right to self-determination with an option of independence. And there are people who have sided and wanted to accede to Pakistan. And then there has been a strong movement for independence. And there has been a collaborator class which is still operational and does most of India's colonial work alongside the militarized governance that was in place till 2019. So slowly and steadily through different treaties, especially the Article 370, which became the special status within India that Kashmir had, which guaranteed its semi-autonomy and also gave some of the control in communication, currency, and foreign affairs to India. So that Article 370 actually acted as a Trojan horse. On one side, it also had a positive element that it secured the territorial sovereignty of people. It kept their citizenship intact, the indigenous rights intact. But on the other side, it was also handing over a lot of decisions to India. And slowly and steadily, India brought in many statutes that literally eroded the autonomy agreement between the Kashmiri governance at that time and also the Indian side. So by 2019, what you have is a very nominal form of the autonomy agreement in place. It's been eroded. It doesn't have much meat, except for the territorial sovereignty, the 35A clause, as it was called. That's still in place. So people are still permanent residents, as they were called, which was a form of citizenship that they had. So technically, they held dual citizenship. They were Kashmiri permanent residents. And then for foreign travel or any other thing that they wanted through the Indian government, they had the passport, which was under the Indian status. In 2019, that goes away. A lot of Kashmiris at that time saw this treaty that was between Kashmiris and the Indian government. They were of the opinion that if it dissolves, there is no other way but that the relationship between India and Kashmiris is going away. But the Indian government had done something very clever. It had not taken the clause out as much as they had deoperationalized it, because that was how it could be done. So it still is in the Indian constitution, but it's just not operational. So through that, what the Indian government did was it had already dismissed the local administration in 2018 or 2017. And then for several years, it was just this nominal government that was done through this nominee of the current right-wing Hindu government, which is called the governorship. But that has also been operational in the past. So what I want to say here is that in the recent times, 2019 is seen as a time when Kashmir's autonomy has gone away, the territorial sovereignty has gone away, and it's kind of seen as a departure from what must have been before that, but that's not true. For Kashmiris, liberal secular governments or right-wing governments have been the same. There is also slight evidence in media every now and then when the people from secular governments, like one minister mentioned that they had done exactly the same thing what BJP, the current Hindutva party, has done, but they had done it very discreetly 12 times. What he meant by it was that they had eroded the Article 370, and by 2019, it was completely gone. We also have evidence in what the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, said in the early 60s, that the autonomy has to go away. So that kind of showcased at that moment, not visibly enough and explicitly, but the colonial and the settler colonial designs that India always had on Kashmir. So steadily we have seen in history, in the last 70 years, in every decade, Kashmiris rising up for their rights and they being repressed very badly. And from 1989, when we have the armed struggle start, we have seen human rights violations. They are widespread. We have disappearances. We have 70,000 plus people who have been killed, 10,000 plus disappeared. Rape has been used as a weapon of war. We have the world's first mass blindings. That's the level of, it's a mix of different penal punishments that have been meted out on Kashmiri people. That's still going on, but in a different mode. Now you have this new thing after 2019, what India calls normalization. Kashmir is normal. Kashmiris are deemed to be happy. Kashmiris are deemed as if they are endorsing the Indian government. And that is kind of imposed by this mix of laws that have been passed from 2019 onwards, which have changed the land, which have altered the land rights of people. As I said earlier, they had the indigenous rights to land, to franchise, to holding property and holding office. That's completely gone now. After 2019, what you see is settler colonial policies on steroids, which were already there before, but they were not as manifest because you still had some kind of local administration. They have been enervated to an extent that today you have someone who has been elected in last year, but that legislative assembly cannot do much. They cannot legislate at all. So they are just nominal Kashmiris, client politicians moving around. On the other hand, land appropriation, demolitions, everything that you do to people, and also is reminiscent of what's happening in Palestine for the last 70 years, as far as dispossession goes, occupation goes. That's happening in Kashmir. And after 2019, it's every day there are new laws. It's very hard to keep pace as to what is happening. But Kashmiri, the indigenous people, do not have the same rights. The colonial benefit is going to people in New Delhi and other states, while the people inside Kashmir, they don't have the same kind of employment benefits anymore. As a result, what's also happening is that economic depravity is on the rise. One of the industries that's really encouraged is tourism, which has become the soft colonial industry that is a really dependent servile economy. And every now and then we see how that's taken away from people and how they are made to feel how dependent they are on Indian economy. So that's kind of what has been going on, and there's more that we can talk about. And we also know about the recent Pahalgam attacks, which brought India, Pakistan to the brink of war, and then they exchanged some strikes. But even in that, what we saw was that Kashmiris on the both sides of the line of control did the dying. And it was the nation states that were fighting and making this dispute bilateral, so to speak, which they have done in 1971, and with Kashmiris completely sidelined.
Yeah, thank you so much for those introductions to the situation in Kashmir. And I think it's really important to have that sort of background because I think to a lot of people, when they hear the term Kashmir, they think of this thing called the Kashmir conflict that's usually thought of as a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. And some people may also know that China is in some way involved. But I think it obscures the reality of the fact that Kashmir is a colonized place and there are people who live there who are experiencing colonization. And even, I mean, recently, like the reason that people have started to read again about Kashmir in the news is again because of the fact that there has been an escalation between India and Pakistan that has brought the two states almost to the brink of war. A lot of people do know that Kashmir is in some ways divided between a side where there is Indian rule and a side where there is Pakistani rule. And I think now that we've had a lot of sort of like these key terms introduced, it may be good to kind of go back to that and explain why that is the case and how that came to pass.
Yeah, I can maybe jump in on this. So, I mentioned that there was this act of ethnic cleansing in 1947 by the Maharaja, especially in the Jammu region and in the western portions of the princely state, as the people there were against his rule, would have most likely wanted to join Pakistan, were afraid that he was going to join India. And so, what's important about that massacre, it's called the Jammu massacre. It's been erased in a lot of histories that Ather was mentioning in terms of kind of the Indian nationalist histories of how this issue came to be. But it fundamentally changes the demographics of that region from a Muslim majority to a Hindu majority. And so the moment that this dispute is starting is under this massive act of violence and ethnic cleansing that happens. And so India and Pakistan basically, I also wanted to mention that the part of the story that is often focused on, though, is that people from northwest Pakistan, the Pashtun tribesmen, basically came towards the state in hearing about this massacre and in solidarity with the people of the state, who many of them had economic and business and trade and other ties with, family ties with, they wanted to liberate the Muslims of this region from this Hindu monarch. And so as they were coming towards the state, there was a panic in the state administration. And this is when basically the Maharaja flees Srinagar and tries to get assistance, military assistance from the Indian government. And so the Indian government basically says that they will only provide him with military assistance if he accedes to India. And so that's where this quote unquote treaty of accession is signed, although it's disputed like how he signed it, when he signed it, etc. And the Indian army basically comes in the next day after he allegedly signed it. And that's when many people believe that, India's basically formally begins in October 1947. So what's important about this, and the reason why there are these two different sides of Kashmir, is that um, India and Pakistan basically formally go to war after the Treaty of Accession is signed. That's when India actually takes this issue to the United Nations, which calls for a cessation of hostilities and also a plebiscite or some sort of referendum. But as all of that is happening, they basically also impose this ceasefire line between the parts of the state that is under Pakistan's control and the parts of the state that's under India's control. And so that ceasefire line is what divides the Pakistan and the Indian administered side. For the Pakistan administered side, it's important to note that the people, the rebels who basically fought against the Maharaja, they had liberated a portion of that territory in October 1947. They call that Azad Kashmir. And so that's sort of the sliver of territory next to the Kashmir Valley. And after the war, they basically reached out to the Pakistan government and sought some sort of autonomous status with the Pakistan state. And then Gilgit-Baltistan, which is also under Pakistan's administration, was actually ruled separately as an agency. It had more of a British presence in it at the time of princely rule. And the Gilgit Scouts basically also fought against the Maharaja, liberated that territory, and also sought some kind of relationship with with the Pakistan state. On the Indian side, there's three parts which basically made up of the Indian administered or occupied part of Kashmir, which was the Kashmir Valley, Jammu, which again I had mentioned had been ethnically cleansed, and then also Ladakh, which is a region that kind of shares a lot of cultural and economic ties with Tibet, and so it's kind of more kind of east in terms of its orientation. And so this region, as Ather mentioned, the client politicians that were placed in power were promised some kind of nominal autonomy, what was enshrined in Article 370. And from the people, like the client regime's perspectives, they thought that this would be the fundamental relationship between Kashmir and the Indian Union. Whereas from the Indian perspective, this was just temporary until like the issue wasn't so internationalized and India had basically managed to fully take it over. And then the plan was that it would eventually be fully integrated into the Indian Union. And so that is kind of the genesis of these two different parts of Kashmir.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, the next thing I was going to ask about actually was if we could go a little bit more into Article 370 and how that comes to be agreed and signed and enshrined into the Constitution. And I guess another kind of like two related questions actually that come out of it are, why was it so important for India to control Kashmir? I mean, obviously, a lot of people bring up the fact that Nehru himself was of Kashmiri Pandit origin, but at the same time, of course, migration away from the homeland was, a reality for millions of people at that historical moment. I mean, even as recently as the previous, Indian prime minister, he was, Manmohan Singh was also born in what's now Pakistan. What other factors were at play? Because I think a lot of people kind of reduce it to just that, when of course there's much more involved in it. And also, what is in it for these sort of Kashmiri client politicians who agreed to Article 370? Could we possibly think about what possibly was the end game of that for them?
I can maybe start with the second question and then Ather can add. So I would say that for Sheikh Abdullah in particular, he wanted to rule over Kashmir. He wanted to be the kind of the main figure in charge. And he was not promised autonomy by Pakistan or Jinnah or the Muslim League, but he was by the Indian National Congress and Nehru. And he also had kind of like this plan, you could call it kind of like a political and economic program with was called the Naya Kashmir Manifesto. It was modeled after kind of like Soviet-style manifestos or five-year plans. And so he was interested in kind of empowering Kashmir's population, obviously many of whom had suffered under Dogra rule. And so he thought that India would give him the kind of political and space to do so. And yet, of course, part of his issue then with the Indian leadership is that they were not willing to. One of the things that they were against was the land reform that he had tried to implement. Land reform in Kashmir basically was done along lines. It was done along class lines, but it was also basically along religious lines because many of the people who were granted land as tenants were Muslim, and many of the landlords in this political economy of Kashmir were Hindu. And so many members of the Indian National Congress and the Hindu right in India, as well as in Jammu, saw this as kind of like an anti-Hindu move in the state. Some people say that this is also one of the reasons why he was eventually removed from power. But I think for him, it was just this promise of autonomy that then ended up being a veneer. And then I think after that, the way that I see many of these kind of politicians operate is that this is a system that is kind of a nation state system that is imposed right from above. And many of them are opportunists. They want to be in power. Many of them also took a lot of benefits, including Bakshi, the person who I studied, who ruled after Sheikh Abdullah for about a decade. You know, his family basically got extremely wealthy for him being a client politician. So I think it's kind of personal visions of grandeur and also just corruption, but also perhaps it's the limitation of the whole system altogether, where they feel that they have to make something work within this kind of status framework.
It's
Ather, do
still
you want to
addressing, I
talk
guess,
about
the
why
question of
India colonized? Like, why was India so interested in
yeah,
Kashmir?
yeah, yeah. That was the question to come back to.
You can get into too much nitty-gritty while answering this question, but I think at the top of my head, I want to also bring your attention to the fact that India had really, really spent a lot of time in creating a very sort of like it had spent a lot of time in doing diplomacy even before it was seeing itself as the nation state it became later on. And it had spent a lot of time inside Kashmir doing that. And we see and the strategicness of Kashmir, its resources, and also what it presented to this nation state of India, which was portraying itself to be anti-colonial and was at the head of the non-aligned movement. And Jawaharlal Nehru was, posed as a world statesman, so to speak. So there was a lot of personal relations as well with Sheikh Abdullah, where they had a joint rally where they, sang, not sang, but they kind of had this Persian verse which said that you are me and I am you, like, we are basically both one person. And that was kind of their promise to each other. So there's that also going on. There's the personal relations. And of course, India wants Kashmir because it is prestigious in so many ways. There's strategic, the geography of Kashmir and its resources, and then also the prestige that it brings to the entire India, which is basically posing as this pluralistic, diverse, multicultural nation state that it's becoming. So I think those are all important things for India, but I think the land and territory and water resources, which we now know how important are, they also play a role. And then it's the personal relationships that they had already built with the who now are seen clearly as collaborators by Kashmiri people. There was a time when Sheikh Abdullah was seen as this staunch nationalist, and he was also coveting a constitutional democracy, a sovereignty of some sort. But I think the nation state system didn't allow it, and he threw in his lot with India. And people were not with it. People were not supporting him dominantly, except for a section of people in the valley. And they also had been literally kind of engineered into that kind of compliance. And now when people are looking back and they are reliving, revising the narratives that they have been told, and they're culling these histories from their parents and from their grandparents and from, whatever written records we have. And we have a lot that has been written in Kashmiri and Urdu and also English, which has not been read outside. So the kind of work we are doing and thinking right now and presenting it to the Western audiences and maybe other parts of the globe, that kind of work has already been done by a lot of people inside Kashmir. It's just that they could not bring it to that stage and kind of create a conversation globally. But these things have been revisited. So in that, I feel like Sheikh Abdullah's figure always, that Hafsa already talked about, he kind of like emerges this larger than life figure who is fighting the Dogras at one point. And then suddenly, after 1931, after this execution of 22 people that happened who were rising up against the monarch, and he was part of that movement as well. And then you have other Kashmiris. And then what happens in that period of time till 1940s is also very important to consider. I kind of think that the Indian diplomacy was at work, and there is evidence that they were at work far ahead than what Pakistan was doing at that time, and the kind of relationships that they shared with Kashmiris. So that's also played a big role in kind of like creating this client politician class. And of course, many of them, and that Hafsa has already studied, Bakshi, he's kind of like seen as the worst opportunist, but Sheikh Abdullah is not seen in any kind of light as well. And no one is going to be surprised if we were to think that it's Sheikh Abdullah's progeny that is ruling Kashmir every now and then and coming into power. And it's also interesting to say that Bakshi actually told his offsprings not to join politics because it's dirty in Kashmir.
Yeah, thank you. I think those were great responses. And I think it's really important to kind of point out as well, a lot of people nowadays, when they think about what India is doing in Kashmir, it's often linked to, the rise of the BJP and the far right in India and sort of this rise of Hindutva. And a lot of people, I think, who have recently become aware of Kashmir have mistakenly thought that, the idea of colonizing it and making it, integral, so to speak, to India is really a project of this particular government's form of nation building and state building. Of course, it's connected to that idea of Akhand Bharat, like a great undivided India that stretches from, I mean, depending on what map you look on, from like Afghanistan to like Southeast Asia. But I'm really grateful and glad that, you mentioned that it was, a part of previous ideas of Indian state building as well. And I think, of course, with that being said, I mean, they are also connected in a certain way that India's project from the beginning, at least in my view, had always been just different faces of Brahmanism, I would say even. Perhaps maybe we can go a little bit deeper into that if either of you want to address it, or we can move on to different topics.
Yeah, no, I think this is important because part of what I mentioned earlier was this point about like constructing this Hindu indigeneity or this Hindu identity for Kashmir during the British colonial and the Dogra period. And so many of India's nationalist leaders really internalized those narratives. And so even for someone like Nehru, the thing that is most compelling to him about Kashmir, aside from its beauty and the kind of weird way he talks about it, he talks about its Hindu history. And how it was a site for Brahmin learning and Sanskrit. And he's very kind of dismissive of its space for Islam and Muslimness. And so I think even though this idea of secular nationalism that India wanted to present itself, especially in opposition to Pakistan in 1947 to the international community, that, Pakistan was this theocratic state and India was secular, and that's why it was so great that this Muslim majority region had chosen to join India. At the same time, when it came to how Indian leaders at that time understood Kashmir, it was primarily through this prism of, well, this is a Hindu region, and that's why it belongs to India. So one of the things that I argue in my book is that Hindu majoritarianism and secular nationalism in India actually have a very close constitutive relationship. They're not in oppositional to one another. And then Kashmir also really allows us to see some of those important through lines between Indian secular nationalism and of course now what's called Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. Fundamentally, these are Brahmanical projects. They just may have different iterations or understandings of the role that minorities or minoritized communities should play. But they are ultimately both colonial in nature or imperial in nature.
And it did raise its head very early in Kashmir, like the fleeing monarch, the gold worker who was one of the stalwarts of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the parent party of, or the militia that is behind the Bharatiya Janata Party today. He made visits to Kashmir to get the monarch to see the idea of joining with India, because the monarch himself for some time was really undecided. He wanted to stay independent, and then he also had this he was a little bit of a playboy and liked to travel Europe, and he had all those little sides to him. And that's kind of when he's also being and then through the Jammu massacre that Hafsa already talked about, he is actually seen distributing arms and ammunition, and RSS is a part of that, the militia that actually does the massacre. So, and then also if you look at Sheikh Abdullah in 1951, after they do the elections, which the United Nations calls out of order because the dispute is sub judice, you cannot have elections in such a place. In that moment, after the elections, in a couple of years, I think he's deposed and he's thrown in jail. And by then, he had also realized the militant Hindu nature, the Brahminical nature of what India had imposed in a different idiom altogether, which wasn't so visible. And I think that kind of has not been analyzed as much as it should have. But later on, he again kind of kowtows to India. After he was in political wilderness for 21 years, he was exiled for some time, he was in jail. But in 75, he again kowtows to India, and that kind of starts what finally comes to head in 1989 or even 84 for that matter. So you can kind of see early on RSS raising its head in Kashmir. And what we see now with Akhand Bharat and sort of making Kashmir seem to be this lost Hindu land as sort of like the civilizational war that's going on in the minds of Hindutva groups, and also like now the masses in India, because it seems like everyone is on the same page. It has raised its head very early on in Kashmir, and that history actually a lot of Kashmiris had to relearn. They had to revisit those periods because that was not rendered to Kashmiris as such. Many Kashmiris, because what the taught part of the history was the Indian hegemonic narrative, in which Azad Kashmir was not freed by the soldiers from Punch, and as they were helped by their counterparts by the Pashtun counterparts, and also what became Pakistani army, some people from there as well. So they were seen as raiders inside Kashmir, and it's now only that people are kind of revisiting the aggression that Indian military did after they came into Kashmir, and some of them had already been there before October 27. So one of the things that we also kind of think that critically needs to be revisited, this idea of partition. Partition, I feel like, of course, there was a lot of violence that happened when the two nations were created, but I think the word creation is very important to partition because it also gives India this lease to think of itself as an unbroken civilizational entity from times immemorial. And I think that does a disservice to peoples all across the subcontinent, not just the Kashmiris. And that's very important for us to think with, because that's also where India gets away with its post-coloniality, that it sits over and lords over for the last 50 years, and then also as subaltern school of thought, where Kashmiris are completely invisibilized, where Kashmir history is completely invisibilized, and then you can downgrade it as internal colonialism, this and that, but it's a rank Indian occupation, and now it's a full-blown settler colonial movement, settler colonial policy that's in operation. And the other thing we also want to kind of like start thinking about is like when people are questioning, like, is it really settler colonialism? India is a democracy. We have to kind of start thinking about post-colonial democracies that have kind of gotten away with their settler colonial nature and the Westphalian nation state system that is in their DNA, which is inherently settler. So these are questions that we kind of like need to unpack while revisiting Kashmir's history. And I think Hafsa's book and many other works that are underway in this moment, they are kind of unpacking these questions, and then also the side of Indian colonialism and military occupation that has really unraveled Kashmir. And in this moment, Kashmiris are completely dispossessed. Today, they can't even speak because an array of laws ensures that people who would speak will not, because it will cost them their home, their job, and also get people who are around them, their immediate family, also arrested, and someone who is even far in that extended family arrested, just because the penalization has become so intense and focused and individual based.
So this was the end of part 1. Join us next week for part 2, in which our host and guests get into the Kashmiri resistance and the Kashmir Intifada. If you'd like to listen to the full episode, it is already available on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. That is patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. Thank you for listening.